The Winslow estate sat above Newport Harbor, the way old money always sits quietly without apology, as though it had always been there and always would be. In December, the harbor below turned the color of hammered steel, and the wind off the water carried the kind of cold that reminded a man he was getting older whether he wanted to or not. But tonight, the estate's windows burned gold against all of that darkness. Tonight, there were white roses on every table and candlelight on every surface, and the sound of a string quartet moving through the main hall like warm water filling a room that had been cold for too long. Garrett Winslow stood at the head of his dining table and looked at what 11 months had built. He was 68 years old. He had buried a wife. He had spent 4 years learning how to eat breakfast alone and sleep in a bed that was too large and answer questions at charity galas about how he was doing with the particular smile that meant he was done answering that question. He had built Winslow Group from a regional construction firm into something that touched the infrastructure of 6 states: hospitals, logistics, networks, federal healthcare contracts, 40 years of decisions that had outlasted the men who made them. He had done all of it, and he had done most of it well, and none of it had prepared him for the specific unglamorous work of being alone at 64 when the person who had known him best was suddenly gone. He had not expected to love anyone again. He had not been looking. Then Celeste Harmon had appeared. She stood beside him now in ivory, her dark hair falling over one shoulder, the diamond on her left hand catching the candlelight every time she moved. She had a way of moving through a room that made people watch her without quite knowing they were watching a quality of presence that seemed effortless and was not. Garrett had noticed it the first night they met at a foundation dinner in Providence 11 months ago. He had noticed it every night since. 11 months, long enough to be certain, long enough to stop asking himself whether this was real and simply let it be real. He had told himself that was wisdom, that a man of 68 who had spent 4 years in grief had earned the right to stop questioning a good thing when it arrived. He raised his glass. 30 guests raised theirs. The string quartet shifted into something quieter and more tender, and the evening felt like an arrival, the end of something hard and the beginning of something that might finally be simple. He did not know that the woman beside him had been planning this moment for much longer than 11 months. He did not know that her patience had been a professional quality, not a personal one. He did not know that the plate set before him, the one Edna Pruitt had prepared separately as she always did, with lighter sauce and no black pepper, marked with a small gold flower near the rim, that everyone in the kitchen recognized as his had already been visited. And he did not know that in the kitchen behind the pantry cabinet, a little girl was sitting very still on a step stool with a cloth doll under her arm and a box of colored pencils beside her, and that she had seen everything. He did not know any of that yet. He was still happy. Lily had been in the kitchen since before the guests arrived. She was 8 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of going quiet when the world got loud around her. She sat on her step stool in the corner near the pantry, feet dangling 2 inches above the floor, a cloth doll tucked under one arm, and her box of colored pencil open on the stool beside her. She had been working on a picture of a horse brown with a white star on its forehead for the better part of an hour, and she was almost finished with the star. Her mother, Ruth Greer, had worked in this house for 6 years. Ruth was careful and efficient and understood with the deep understanding of someone who had learned it young the particular skill required to exist inside someone else's home without disturbing it. She had not taught Lily this skill deliberately. She had simply lived it in front of her daughter every day, and Lily had absorbed it the way children absorb the most important things completely, without being asked, without even knowing it was happening. Be small. Stay quiet. Don't give anyone a reason to look at you. Lily had mostly learned, but she was still 8 years old, and 8-year-olds notice things whether they mean to or not. She was adding white to the star on the horse's forehead when she heard the heels. Not the rubber-soled shoes the kitchen staff wore, not her mother's soft-soled flats that made almost no sound on the hardwood. These were different, deliberate, and measured each step, placed with the particular awareness of someone who understood that the sound of their walking was itself a kind of statement. Lily looked up over the edge of the pantry cabinet. Celeste Harmon stepped into the kitchen from the side hallway. She moved the way she always moved, head slightly, turned eyes traveling the room in one smooth, unhurried arc. Taking inventory, making sure. The kitchen staff were clustered near the far stove, focused on the final preparations and bent away from the door. Edna Pruitt had stepped out through the service entrance 2 minutes earlier to check on the dining room arrangements. Ruth was somewhere near the buffet table, adjusting the placement of something Garrett had said he wanted positioned differently. The kitchen was as close to empty as it was going to be at any point during the evening. Celeste opened her purse. It was silver and it caught the overhead light the way everything about her caught light deliberately, precisely as though even reflections had been arranged in advance. She reached inside and removed something small, a folded packet, white flat between two fingers. Not a bottle, not a jar, not a container of any kind that would suggest quantity or storage. A single packet, the kind that holds one measured amount of something and is designed to be used once and then disappear. Lily set her colored pencil down without making a sound. Celeste moved to the service counter where the finished plates waited in a careful line. Each one covered with a domed silver lid, except the last two, which were being finished by the kitchen staff across the room. She looked at the line once, then reached for the one set apart from the others, the plate with the small gold flower painted near the rim. Edna's marking system, used for 6 years, understood by everyone who worked in this kitchen. Garrett's dish, prepared separately because he could not eat black pepper and had not been able to for 30 years and saw no reason to apologize for it. Celeste knew which plate was his. She reached for it without hesitation. She opened the packet over the pale cream sauce. A fine white powder fell into the cream and disappeared almost instantly, absorbed into the surface without a mark, without a color change, without any indication that the dish was now something different from what Edna had prepared. Celeste produced a small spoon from her coat pocket and stirred once around, then again, slow enough to be thorough, careful enough to leave no visible trace. Then she folded the empty packet closed and tucked it into her palm, curling her fingers around it. She placed the spoon beneath a folded linen towel on the prep station, pressing it flat out of sight. She closed her purse. 3 seconds passed. Then a soft knock came at the rear service door. 2 quiet raps, the kind designed to carry only a few feet and no further. Celeste crossed the kitchen in the same measured walk and opened the door 2 inches. The man outside stood in the December cold with his collar turned up and his face angled away from the light coming through the gap. He did not step inside. He did not need to. One hand extended through the 2-inch opening. Celeste pressed a white envelope into it. The man spoke. Lily was 12 feet away behind the pantry cabinet, and she caught only a few words across the width of the kitchen. The voice was low and certain, the voice of someone confirming something that has already been decided, not asking about something still in question. Tonight has to work. Celeste said nothing that Lily could hear. The door closed. Celeste stood with her back to the kitchen for a moment, perfectly still, in the way that a person stands when they are checking something internal, running through a sequence, confirming a count, making sure nothing has been forgotten. Then she smoothed the front of her ivory dress with one hand, lifted her chin to its customary angle, and walked back toward the dining room. Her heels clicked the same unhurried rhythm as before. She did not look at the plate with the gold flower rim as she passed it. She did not need to look at it anymore. She did not look toward the pantry cabinet. She did not see the little girl sitting in the corner with a half-colored horse on her knee and both hands pressed flat against her legs to stop them from shaking. Lily sat without moving for a long moment after the sound of the heels disappeared. She looked at the plate on the service counter. She looked at the folded linen towel where the spoon was hidden beneath it. She looked at the closed service door and thought about the voice that had come through the 2-inch gap in the envelope that had passed through it. Then she did something that would matter more than she knew. She climbed down from the step stool, set her drawing carefully on the seat, and crossed the kitchen quickly and quietly to the waste bin near the prep station. The folded packet, the one Celeste had tucked into her palm, was not there yet. Celeste had taken it with her. But the linen towel was there, and under it the spoon. Lily did not touch the spoon. She was 8 years old and she did not know exactly what she had seen, but she understood enough to know that the spoon was something the woman had hidden on purpose, and that hidden things should stay where they were found. She looked once more at the plate with the gold flower rim. Then she picked up her doll, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of the kitchen. She did not run yet. Running was for when there was no more time to think. She still had a few seconds, and she used them the way a child uses the last few seconds before a decision becomes irreversible. Not by analyzing what she had seen, but by feeling the full weight of it settle into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She felt it land, she felt what it meant. Then she ran. Her shoes skidded on the hardwood floor of the dining room. One hand caught the side of her dress so she wouldn't trip. The other pointed straight at the plate being carried toward the table by one of the servers. The plate with the gold flower rim, the one that was going to be set in front of Garrett Winslow. "Don't eat that, sir. Please." She put something in it. The music did not stop immediately, but the room did. Garrett Winslow looked down at the child beside his chair. He had known Lily for 3 years in the way that powerful men know the children of household staff, with a decent, focused warmth that asked nothing specific of either party. She was small. She was Ruth's daughter. She was usually so quiet that sometimes an entire evening passed without him being certain she was in the house at all. She was not quiet now. "That food has something bad in it," she said. Her voice shook, but it did not break, and she did not lower it. "You can't eat it. Please, sir, stop." 30 guests held what they were holding and did not move. Forks paused between plate and mouth. Glasses hovered. At the far end of the long table, Eleanor Winslow, 72 years old, Garrett's mother, a woman who had outlasted 2 recessions, 1 hostile acquisition attempt, and a family scandal that would have destroyed a lesser name, and who had never in 7 decades required noise to make her presence felt, set down her water glass with a soft, precise sound and looked at Celeste Harmon. Not at the child, at Celeste. Celeste had risen from her chair. One hand was pressed against her chest. Her eyes had gone precisely beautifully moist at the exact moment the situation called for it. Her voice, when it came, arrived at a volume calibrated to reach every guest at the table without appearing to be aimed at any of them. "Lily, that is a terrible thing to say." Ruth appeared at the service's doorway. Her face had gone the color of old chalk. She crossed the room with the particular walk of someone for whom each step is simultaneously an apology and a prayer, reaching for her daughter's shoulders before she had fully arrived. "Mr. Winslow, Miss Harmon, I am so sorry. She was supposed to stay near the kitchen. She must have misunderstood something she saw. She's a child. "I didn't misunderstand," Lily said. No raised voice, no tears, no performance of any kind. Just a statement offered plainly in the tone of a child who has not yet learned that truth is sometimes insufficient in a room full of people who have decided what they want to believe. The murmur moved through the table like a current, finding the path of least resistance. Someone near the middle said attention-seeking, quietly enough to pretend it was private. Someone else said children do this at big events. Too much stimulation, too much excitement. A man, 3 seats from the head, leaned toward his wife and said the word that landed softest but cut deepest: jealous. Her mother works here. She wanted to be part of it. She wanted to be noticed. Ruth heard every word. Her shoulders did not move. Her eyes stayed down. Lily heard every word too. Her face did not change in the way that faces change when something hurts and the hurt wins. It changed in the other way, the quieter, harder way that faces change when a person decides that being hurt is not going to be the thing that determines what they do next. Garrett leaned forward slightly. He kept his voice measured, and even the voice of a man who has conducted difficult conversations across boardroom tables for 4 decades and believes in giving every claim its fair hearing. "Lily, is it possible you saw one of the kitchen staff adding seasoning to the dish? Salt can look like a powder when the light catches it, or flour maybe." "No, sir." Her voice was steady. "It came from Miss Celeste's purse. She took it out of her purse and put it in your food. And then a man came to the back door, and she gave him an envelope." The murmur shifted in tone. Celeste's composure shifted with it, not into anger, which would have been too readable, but into something more carefully chosen. Sorrow. The specific photogenic sorrow of a woman who has been wronged in the one place and on the one evening when she had every right to expect to be safe. "Garrett," she said, her voice dropping to a register meant for him alone, but pitched to carry. "Surely you're not going to—" "I'm asking a question," he said. The table watched him. Conrad Mabley, Garrett's attorney, was seated 3 places down the table and had spent the last 90 seconds watching the plate with the gold flower rim not the child and not Celeste. Dr. Philip Tate Garrett's physician of 15 years sat directly across and had gone very still in the way that physicians go still when a social situation begins to carry clinical weight. At the far end of the table, Eleanor had not moved and had not looked away from Celeste. Garrett looked at his plate. Then he looked at Lily. She had not moved. She had not reached for her mother's hand or looked at the floor or done any of the things that children do when the weight of a room full of adult doubt begins to press down on them. She was 8 years old and she was standing in the center of 30 people who had collectively decided she was wrong and she had not moved. Something shifted in him. It was quiet, that shift, the kind of internal adjustment that happens before the mind has finished constructing its argument, before the logic has caught up with the knowing. He felt it. He recognized it in the way that a man of 68 who has survived enough to develop some instinct recognizes the feeling of being right about something he wishes he were wrong about. He almost stopped. He almost set the fork down right there. He almost said, "Enough. Let's take a breath. Let's figure out what's actually happening here. Let the evening become whatever the evening was going to become." He could feel the pull of it, thin as wire, running just beneath the surface of everything he had built. In 11 months, the pull toward the right choice. But the wire broke under the weight of 30 guests and Celeste's wounded eyes and 11 months of evenings that had made him feel like a complete person again after 4 years of feeling like half of one. He picked up his fork. The sound Lily made was not a word. It was something quieter and more complete than a word, a single short breath that carried everything she had left to say and knew would not be heard. She grabbed the plate with both hands and pulled it toward her, pressing it against her chest and keeping it level so the sauce would not spill. "He can't eat this," she said. "Please, please, just please don't." The room came apart. Chairs scraped. Two guests stood. Someone's glass hit a neighbor's arm, and water spread across the white tablecloth. Garrett stood and reached for the plate, and Lily turned her small body away, and for a moment that had no business being complicated. A grown man, a child, a ceramic plate. It became something else entirely. His hands found the rim. Her hands were already there, her thin fingers white at the knuckles with the effort of holding on. He looked at her face. She was not performing. She was not seeking anything. She was genuinely, specifically terrified, the kind of terror that belongs only to a person who can see clearly what is about to happen and has run out of ways to prevent it. He took the plate. He took it because the room was watching, because Celeste was watching, because 68 years of building things and being right and being certain had not left any room in him for the possibility that a little girl on a step stool in the corner of his kitchen had seen something he had missed. He set the plate on the table. He looked at Lily, at the empty-handed stillness of her, at the piano pressed against her chest and the chin that had not dropped. Then he looked at Celeste, who pressed one hand over her mouth and said something quiet and relieved that was designed to end the matter. He cut a small piece of fish. He gathered a little of the pale cream sauce. He raised the fork. Lily stood with empty hands and said nothing more. Every argument had been made. Every plea had been refused. Every physical attempt had been overridden by someone larger and more certain than she was. There was nothing left to do but watch. So she watched. She watched Celeste, not Garrett. She watched the ivory dress and the diamond ring and the hand that reached out to touch Garrett's arm at precisely the right moment with precisely the right weight of relief. She watched the eyes that closed at exactly the right second in exactly the right way. And she remembered those eyes in the kitchen. She remembered the way they had moved not toward the plate, not with the look of a woman checking that a meal prepared for someone she loved was going to be right. The way they had moved to the clock on the wall, the way they had settled there patient and calculating for 2 full seconds before Celeste turned and walked back to the dining room. Watching a clock is not the same as watching a man you love. Lily knew the difference. She was 8 years old and she knew the difference. 45 seconds after Garrett ate, he set his fork down. 60 seconds after that, he shifted in his chair and pressed one hand lightly against his abdomen. He thought it was nerves, the accumulated tension of an embarrassing evening finding somewhere to go. He swallowed. His mouth had gone dry in a way that seemed unrelated to thirst. Then the heat came up the back of his neck. Then the room tilted. Eleanor said his name from the far end of the table. Her voice arrived to him the way voices arrive when the body is doing something wrong, present but slightly delayed like sound traveling through water. Garrett gripped the edge of the table. His face had gone the color of old paper. Dr. Tate was already moving around the end of the table, not running, moving with the specific controlled urgency of a physician who has trained himself not to alarm the room while also not wasting a single second. Celeste turned to Garrett with a sound that filled the room. A cry pitched just 1 degree past genuine, designed to announce rather than to reach, to perform an alarm for an audience rather than to express it to a person. She grabbed his shoulder. She looked around the table. She said, "Why is no one helping him?" in the voice of a woman for whom this sequence of events was an emergency she had not anticipated, rather than an outcome she had been watching for. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "Philip," she said, "my son." Dr. Tate reached Garrett and took his wrist and looked at his pupils, and the diagnosis that formed on his face in the next 3 seconds was not yet spoken aloud, but it was entirely clear to anyone watching. Garrett Winslow looked across his dining table. Through the candlelight and the white roses and the faces of 30 people who had watched a little girl try to tell the truth and had decided each in their own way and for their own reasons that she was wrong. He found Lily. She was standing exactly where she had been standing since he took the plate from her hands. Perfectly still, cloth doll pressed against her chest. Eyes on him steady and dry, carrying something that no 8-year-old should have to carry, the particular isolating weight of being right when no one believed you, and watching helpless while what you tried to prevent happens anyway. He tried to say something to her. He couldn't. The room tilted fully, and Dr. Tate's hand steadied him, and someone was already calling for an ambulance, and Celeste's voice was filling in all the available space with his performance of panic, and through all of it, Lily did not look away. She had done everything she could. She had told the truth. She had grabbed the plate and held on until her hands were empty. And now she stood in the wreckage of an evening built on a lie, holding her doll, watching the adults finally begin to move with the urgency she had been trying to give them for the last 10 minutes. There was one more thing she could do, one small, quiet thing that no one would see and that she did not know mattered. She turned and walked back to the kitchen. The staff were moving now, drawn toward the dining room by the sound of the commotion. The kitchen was briefly empty. Lily went to the prep station and lifted the folded linen towel. The spoon was there. She did not touch it. But beside the waste bin on the counter's edge, she saw what she had been looking for, the folded white packet placed there by Celeste. When she returned to the kitchen in the confusion, after the alarm was raised, to retrieve it and then forgotten in the rush of performing distress. Lily picked it up. She wrapped it in a paper napkin from the dispenser on the counter. She opened her colored pencil box and placed the wrapped packet carefully between the yellow pencil and the orange one. She closed the box. Then she went back to the dining room to her mother and did not say anything about what she had done. Outside, the December wind pressed against the gold windows of the Winslow estate, and the night went on in the way nights go on, without mercy, without interest, not caring at all what any of this was costing anyone. The ambulance did not use its siren. That was the detail Lily remembered most clearly afterward, the way the vehicle moved through the iron gates of the Winslow estate in near silence, red lights turning without sound, as though even the emergency had been asked to be discreet. She watched it from the window of the guest room, where Ruth had brought her one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, her cloth doll tucked under the other arm, the colored pencil box sitting on the bed behind her where she had placed it carefully, exactly as she would place something she intended to return to. The guests had gone. Their cars had moved down the private road, one by one, taillights disappearing into the dark, carrying people who would spend the drive home deciding what version of what they had witnessed they were going to tell. The dining room had gone quiet. The plate with the gold flower rim sat untouched beneath the chandelier, exactly where Garrett had set it down before the room tilted, and his hand found the edge of the table, and everything changed. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed behind her daughter and did not speak. There was nothing to say that would make the evening smaller than it was, and Ruth had learned long ago that making things smaller was not always the kindness it appeared to be. So she sat, and Lily stood at the window, and outside the red lights turned and turned until they didn't. Newport General's private wing smelled of antiseptic and heated air. and the particular stillness that expensive hospitals maintain for expensive patients, a stillness that is not the same as quiet because it contains too much held breath. Dr. Philip Tate met the gurney at the entrance and walked beside it through the corridor, one hand braced near the rail giving instructions in the short, efficient language of a man who had been Garrett Winslow's physician for 15 years and had never once before needed to use that language for Garrett Winslow personally. He took one bite, Tate told the intake team. Symptoms presented within 90 seconds of ingestion: abdominal cramping, nausea, disorientation, elevated vascular response. No known food allergies. No prior incidents of this nature. Garrett tried to lift himself from the gurney. I can walk. Eleanor Winslow fell into step on the other side without looking at him. You will do no such thing. He did not argue. The nausea was still moving through him in slow rolling waves, and each wave reminded him with great specificity that he was 68 years old and had just consumed something that had no business being inside a human body. It also reminded him with a clarity that the pain seemed to sharpen, rather than dull, that a little girl had stood in front of him with both hands on that plate, and he had taken it from her and eaten anyway. That memory arrived sharper than anything the compound in the sauce could produce. He suspected it would stay that way for a long time. Conrad Mobley arrived 12 minutes after the ambulance coat, still on briefcase, already open in his lap in the back of the car during the drive over. He had made 3 calls. The first to the head of estate security, with instructions that nothing in the kitchen or dining room was to be moved, touched, or removed by anyone for any reason. The second to the senior partner at his firm, because this was no longer a personal matter and had not been since Garrett's fork left the plate. The third to a forensics consultant he had worked with 11 years ago on a fraud case and had genuinely hoped never to need again. He found Eleanor at a hallway outside Garrett's examination room. The plate is secured, he said. Nothing removed. Edna has the kitchen sealed. Security is pulling all footage now, kitchen and exterior. Eleanor nodded once. And the spoon, Conrad paused. Lily mentioned a spoon. Hidden under a linen towel near the prep station. Find it, tonight. Ruth had not wanted to come to the hospital. She had said so 3 times during the drive, her voice low and directed at no one in particular, the words of a woman who understood that certain rooms were not built for her and had learned to stay outside them. This is family business. We shouldn't be here. We should go home and be out of the way. Eleanor Winslow had heard her from the front hallway of the estate and had turned without hurry and said with the particular authority of a woman who had spent 72 years meaning precisely what she said and nothing beyond it. Your daughter tried to save my son tonight. That makes you family enough to be wherever I am. Ruth had not found an answer to that. So she had come. And Lily had come, colored pencil box in her lap, in the back of the car, doll under her arm, eyes on the passing streetlights. Now they sat in the corner of the private family lounge, leather chairs low lighting a nurse stationed near the doorway, with the careful, upright posture of people who understand that a room has been designed for someone else and are working hard not to take up more of it than necessary. Garrett's younger sister Caroline arrived with her husband 20 minutes after Eleanor. She was 44 with her mother's eyes and her brother's habit of going completely still before she spoke, as though she needed to be certain the words were ready before she committed them to the air. She sat across from Lily and studied the child for a long moment without speaking. Then, you're the one who warned him. Lily nodded. What did you see? Ruth straightened. She's had a very long night, Miss Winslow. She doesn't need to go through it again. Caroline looked at Ruth. I know, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to push. Then back at Lily. You don't have to tell me anything. Lily looked at her doll, then at Caroline. I saw Miss Celeste put white powder in his food. From her purse, she stirred it in with a little spoon. Then a man came to the back door and she gave him an envelope. The man said, tonight has to work. The lounge went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that rearranges the air permanently and cannot be unsaid. Conrad, standing near the doorway with his briefcase, was already writing. Inside the examination room, Dr. Tate reviewed the preliminary blood work and felt the specific cold unease of a physician who recognizes a pattern he has been trained to identify and was sincerely hoping he was wrong about. The markers were consistent with ingestion of a foreign compound. Irritants specifically introduced in a quantity that was small but precisely targeted. not a contaminant, not a reaction to something in the food itself, something that had been put into the food with knowledge of what it would do to the specific person who ate it. He sat down in the chair beside Garrett's bed and chose his words the way you choose words when you are about to tell a person something that will divide their life cleanly into before and after. "You're stable," he said. "Heart rhythm is normal. No organ involvement at current exposure levels. You'll be uncomfortable for a while, but you're going to be all right." Garrett looked at the ceiling, at current exposure levels. Tate set his clipboard on his knee. "There's something else I need to discuss with you. The fatigue you've been experiencing, the headaches, the difficulty concentrating that you mentioned at your last two appointments. You attributed it to the stress of the acquisition negotiations." Garrett turned his head. "I attributed it to stress because that's the explanation that made sense." Tate was quiet for a moment. "I know. I'm telling you now that I may have been working from the wrong assumption. The profile I'm looking at tonight is consistent with something that accumulates, something introduced in very small amounts over an extended period, enough to reduce clarity, enough to make a person more susceptible to fatigue and confusion without producing anything dramatic enough to prompt investigation." He paused. "The symptoms you described to me began approximately 8 weeks ago." Garrett was very still. "Celeste moved into the estate 4 months ago." Tate did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was in the silence, and both men knew it. Outside the window, Newport moved in its quiet, late-night rhythm, the distant sound of a boat on the harbor, the low hum of the city that never entirely stopped. Garrett lay in the hospital bed and thought about 8 weeks of mornings when he had been more tired than he should have been. 8 weeks of evenings when concentration had come harder than it usually did. 8 weeks of signing documents and making decisions in a state that he had attributed to age and stress in the ordinary accumulation of a life fully lived. 8 weeks of someone standing close enough to manage what he consumed and patient enough to manage it carefully. The spoon was found by Edna Pruitt before midnight, exactly where Lily had said it would be, beneath the folded linen towel on the prep station. It was bagged and sealed by the estate's security team within the hour. The kitchen was photographed comprehensively before anything was touched. The plate, untouched since Garrett had set it down, remained under its dome on the dining room table, with a member of the security team stationed beside it, until Conrad's forensics contact arrived from Boston at 2 in the morning. Conrad brought the photographs at 7 the following morning. Printed stills from the kitchen security system, copied and stored in 3 separate locations before any external party had been informed that anything unusual had occurred at the Winslow estate. He laid them on the rolling table beside Garrett's bed without preface or softening. Garrett looked at them one at a time with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who has spent 40 years reading documents that other people hoped he would skim. The first photograph showed Celeste entering the kitchen from the side hallway. Her posture was relaxed. Her purse was in her hand. Anyone seeing only this image might see a woman who had come to check on the arrangements for her own engagement dinner, exactly as she had claimed. The second frame showed her hand inside the purse. The third showed the packet between her fingers. The fourth showed the powder disappearing into the cream sauce on the plate with the gold flower rim. It was faint visible only because the overhead light had caught the angle at exactly the right moment, but it was there, and it was unmistakable. And in the lower left corner of the fourth frame, barely visible behind the edge of the pantry cabinet, was the outline of a small child sitting on a step stool with a cloth doll under one arm. The child's face was turned toward the counter where Celeste was standing. She was watching. She had been watching the whole time. Garrett looked at that corner of the photograph for a long time. He had not known she was there. He had not thought to wonder whether anyone was there. It had not occurred to him to consider whether the quiet corner behind the pantry cabinet, where the step stool lived and where Ruth's daughter sometimes sat with her pencils when the kitchen was busy and she had nowhere else to be, might contain a witness. She was right there, he said. Conrad said yes, exactly where she said she was. The fifth photograph showed the spoon. The sixth showed it going under the towel. The seventh showed a man at the rear service door, face angled away, dark jacket, one hand extending to receive the envelope. The image was not perfectly clear, but the posture, the build, the specific angle of the head that kept the face out of frame, all of it was consistent point by point with what Lily had described to a room full of people who had decided she was seeking attention. Garrett set the photographs down. He looked at the harbor through the window, gray and flat in the early morning light, entirely indifferent to everything that had happened on the hill above it the night before. Conrad spoke. There's more. He opened his briefcase and removed a second folder, this one thicker, its contents the result of the overnight work of 3 people who had not slept. The documents Celeste accessed in your study last week, Conrad said. She told Edna she was looking for an old family photograph. He paused. There are no family photographs in the study. Garrett said nothing. What the study does contain, Conrad continued, are the draft contracts for the Federal Healthcare Infrastructure Initiative, the New England Regional Land Agreements, the preliminary charter revisions for the Winslow Children's Foundation, the ones you've been working on to significantly increase the foundation's endowment and expand its scope. Garrett turned from the window. Was anything removed? Conrad's expression remained carefully neutral. We believe several documents were photographed or scanned rather than physically taken. We're still assessing the full scope, but there is something that requires your attention immediately. He opened the folder to a specific page and placed it on the table. Garrett read it once, then he read it again. His face did not change in the way faces change with sudden anger, the flush, the tightening, the visible heat. It changed in the other way, the slower and colder way, the way a face changes when something very large settles into a person and stays. The Winslow Children's Foundation, he said. $1.85 million, Conrad said. Over 6 weeks, individual transfers small enough to pass beneath the automatic flagging threshold, routed through a layered structure of accounts that we are still mapping. The transfers began 6 weeks ago. Garrett looked at the number on the page. 6 weeks ago, on an evening when he had been more tired than usual, when the fatigue that Dr. Tate was now calling something other than stress had been heavier than on most evenings, Celeste had placed a document in front of him and explained it in terms that seemed reasonable and asked him to sign it, a temporary oversight authorization for the foundation. He had been tired. She had been standing beside him with a glass of water and a patient, gentle explanation. He had signed it. That money was for children, he said. The words came out flat and final with no room in them for anything except what they meant. Conrad did not soften it. Yes. Garrett closed the folder. He sat with his hands flat on the hospital blanket and his eyes on the middle distance and the monitor keeping its quiet, steady count beside him. He thought about the specific children the foundation served. He thought about the programs Winslow Group's legal team had spent the better part of a year designing. He thought about what $1.85 million was supposed to do and what it had been made to do instead. Then he said, "Bring Lily in." Ruth tried to object. She had been trying consistently and with diminishing success to keep her daughter one room removed from all of this since the night before, and Garrett understood the impulse because he understood now what it cost to be the one in the room where truth was being weighed and found insufficient. He waited until Ruth had said what she needed to say. Then he looked at her directly. "What Lily saw matters," he said, "and I want her to know that someone is listening now." The word "now" sat in the room after he said it. It was a small word, and it held a great deal. Ruth looked at her daughter. Lily looked back at her mother and gave a nod that was more considered and more certain than it had any right to be on the face of an 8-year-old. They came into the room together, Ruth's hand on Lily's shoulder, Lily's doll under her arm, and the colored pencil box held against her side. Garrett was sitting up in bed. The IV line was taped to the back of his hand. He looked diminished in the way that strong people look, diminished in hospital beds, not broken, not reduced in any permanent sense, but temporarily brought down to the level of everyone else, like a river running low after a long dry season. He looked at Lily for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." Ruth's hand tightened on Lily's shoulder. Lily looked at him steadily with the same direct, assessing look as she had given him across the dining room. The same look that had not wavered when he picked up the fork. "You took the plate back," she said. "Yes," he said it without decoration. "I did, and I'm sorry. That was my mistake. It was not yours." Lily held the apology in front of her for a moment, the way children hold things that cost something to receive, examining it before deciding what to do with it. She did not rush. She did not perform acceptance. Then she said, "Because I'm just the housekeeper's kid." The room went very still. Garrett did not look away. He did not reach for an easier answer. No, he said, because I was afraid of what it would mean if you were right. And I chose what was easier to believe. That is on me, not on you. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, are you going to be okay? The doctor says yes. She absorbed that with a single nod, filing it away with the particular gravity of someone who has learned that the world does not always keep its promises, but who still considers each promise on its individual merits. Then she said something that made Conrad Mabley stop writing and look up. She wasn't scared when you were sick. She got scared when you said cameras. No one spoke. Eleanor, seated near the window, turned to look at the empty chair beside Garrett's, the chair that had been placed there for Celeste when she arrived and from which Celeste had since been asked to leave. She turned and looked at it and said nothing. Conrad picked up his pen. Garrett looked at the little girl standing at the foot of his hospital bed, shoes still scuffed from running across the dining room floor. Colored pencil box held against her side chin at exactly the same level it had been at when she was standing in a room full of 30 people telling her she was wrong. He thought about what it had cost her to stand in that room. He thought about what it cost most people to stand in a room like that and how most people, most adults, most people with far more social armor than an 8-year-old child eventually sat down. She had not sat down. She had grabbed the plate with both hands and held on until she couldn't hold on anymore. And then she had stood still with empty hands and watched him eat, and she had been right about every single thing from the beginning. Outside, the December light came off the harbor thin and cold, and without any of the warmth the candlelight had manufactured the night before. Conrad closed his briefcase. Aldrich Bow Winslow Group's estate manager of 23 years stepped into the doorway long enough to confirm that the estate was secured and all external access had been revoked for everyone whose authorization had been granted through Celeste Harmon's oversight. Conrad would begin the financial forensics that afternoon. But first there was a name. Stafford Keene had appeared in the first pass of the account analysis connected to the shell structure through which the foundation money had been moving, patient and methodical, the kind of operator who built his practice specifically around targets like Garrett Winslow. Men whose influence extended beyond their personal wealth. Men whose names opened rooms that money alone could not. There was more work ahead, much more. But Garrett Winslow was alive, and the reason he was alive was standing at the foot of his hospital bed in scuffed shoes, holding a cloth doll and a box of colored pencils, and she had been right about everything from the moment she climbed down from that step stool in the corner of the kitchen and decided that being believed mattered less than being honest. That was where the story had started. Not with the plate or the powder or the diamond ring or the ivory dress. It had started with Lily on a step stool in the quiet that no one had bothered to fill because no one had thought to look. The envelope arrived at the Winslow estate gate at 11:47 that night. Marcus Brierly left it the way people leave things when they want to be seen, leaving them deliberately without urgency, the white rectangle placed on the stone ledge beside the intercom, with the studied care of someone making a point rather than delivering a message. The security camera captured his face for 4 full seconds before he turned and walked back to the black sedan, idling at the curb without plates that could be read from the camera's angle. The car moved away at an ordinary speed. The departure was as composed as the arrival. Inside the estate, Edna Pruitt brought the envelope to Conrad Mabley without touching it directly, holding it by one corner through a folded dish towel, understanding by instinct or experience or both that things delivered this way should arrive at their destination, the same way they left. Conrad opened it at the kitchen table with gloves from his briefcase while Eleanor Winslow stood in the doorway and watched. One sheet of paper, one typed line, centered on the page. You stopped to one bite. You won't stop what comes next. Conrad read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at Eleanor. She's not running, Eleanor said. No, Conrad agreed. She's not. He was reaching for his phone when Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, in the borrowed pajamas Edna had found in the linen closet doll under one arm, bare feet on the cold tile-colored pencil box held against her chest. Ruth materialized behind her with one hand on her daughter's shoulder, already forming an apology. Lily looked at the paper on the table. She was a strong reader for her age. She read the line once, moving her lips slightly. Then she said, "That's not a threat. She's trying to make you look the wrong way." The kitchen went quiet in a way that was different from all the previous quiet of the evening. Conrad lowered his phone. He looked at the child in the doorway, then at Eleanor, then at the piece of paper. He had arrived at the same conclusion. He had been 45 seconds behind an 8-year-old girl who was standing barefoot on a cold tile floor in borrowed pajamas. Eleanor looked at Lily for a long moment. Then she said simply, "Come in and sit down, both of you." Ruth hesitated. Eleanor did not repeat the invitation. She simply held the doorway open, which was enough. They moved Garrett back to the estate the following morning over Dr. Tate's stated objections and with his reluctant professional release. The estate was more secure than the hospital in every way that now mattered. The security presence had doubled. Every camera had been checked, and where necessary replaced all feeds routed to a secondary monitoring system that had been installed overnight and that Celeste had never known existed. Every access credential associated with her name or granted through her authorization had been revoked before dawn. Garrett walked through the front door under his own power, which he had made clear was not negotiable, and went directly to his study. The desk sat where it had always sat beneath the window that looked out over the winter garden. The same desk, the same window, the same view of the fountain turned off for the season, and the hedges cut back to their winter shapes against the gray December sky. Everything was the same and nothing was the same because now he knew that someone had stood in this room with purposes he had not imagined, had run her hands along his files and read his drafts and photographed the documents that represented 40 years of decisions and relationships and trust that had been built slowly and carefully and was not supposed to be this vulnerable. He stood at the desk for a moment, then he sat down and told Conrad to begin. Stafford Keene had been identified through financial forensics, a partial match on the service door footage combined with transaction signatures that Conrad's forensics contact recognized from 2 previous cases, both of which had collapsed before charges could be filed, because Keene was exceptionally good at being almost findable and never quite there. He was in his early 50s. He had spent 15 years building a specialized practice around a specific type of target, established influential men whose value was not primarily in their liquid assets, but in the access their names and relationships provided. He did not steal money in the conventional sense. He created structures through which influence could be redirected, and he sold access to those structures to people with resources and ambitions that required channels outside the visible economy. "He's not after your money," Conrad said, sitting across the desk. "Not primarily. What Keene sells is leverage. Your contracts with the federal healthcare systems, the infrastructure agreements, the data arrangements, those touch things that people with serious resources want to shape. Celeste was the instrument, the close relationship, the reason you would sign things on evenings when you were not operating at full capacity." Garrett was quiet for a long time. Through the study window, the winter garden was gray and bare, and exactly what it had always been. The fountain was silent. The hedges held their shape. "She moved in 4 months ago," he said. "She started the low-dose exposure 8 weeks ago. She started moving the foundation money 6 weeks ago. Last week she was in this room." Conrad nodded. "The engagement announcement was the threshold," Garrett said. "Once we were publicly engaged, her access to my affairs would have had a legal dimension it doesn't currently have. Certain documents, certain authorizations, they would have been much harder to challenge." Conrad said nothing. The silence was confirmation enough. Garrett turned from the window. "Find Keene, today." They found him in Hartford. Not because Keene made an error in the conventional sense. The man had spent 15 years not making conventional errors. They found him because Conrad's forensics contact traced a financial transfer to a private data facility on the eastern edge of the city, and because the transfer was precisely small enough to seem unremarkable and precisely large enough to confirm that something was being staged. Keene had left one thread visible. Conrad concluded after thinking it through that it had been deliberate, a calibration exercise, a measurement of how quickly Garrett's team could move once they understood what they were dealing with. Garrett went with them. The drive to Hartford took 40 minutes on roads that were ordinary and cold and entirely uninterested in what was happening inside the black SUV moving along them. Garrett sat in the back and watched Connecticut pass outside the window, the bare trees, the exit signs, the ordinary mid-morning traffic of people for whom this Friday was simply a Friday. He thought about the plate in Lily's hands, and the plate in his hands in the moment he had pulled it free. He had told her it was his mistake. He had meant every word of it. But meaning something was not the same as fully understanding what it had cost. And he was still arriving at the full cost mile by mile in the back of a car on a gray December morning. The data facility was a converted commercial building, unremarkable in every detail that was visible from the street. They entered through a side access point Conrad's contact had arranged. Inside, the air was warm and uniformly humming, the sound of servers doing their patient, constant work behind rows of equipment racks blinking in the low light. Stafford Keene was seated at a terminal near the far wall. He turned before they reached him. He had known they were coming. The visible thread had been exactly what Conrad suspected. He was well-dressed in the way of men who understand that clothing is a form of argument. He looked at Garrett with the particular expression of someone who has mentally rehearsed this specific conversation many times and is interested to discover how the actual version differs from the rehearsed one. That was faster than I expected, Keene said. Garrett stopped 6 feet away. You left a thread. Keene tilted his head slightly. I wanted to understand how quickly you could move once the situation was clear. He paused. You move quickly. Where is she? Keene considered the question without apparent urgency. Then, she's already in motion. She has been since last night. What is she moving? The documents from your study. She's not selling them, she's positioning them. There's a meaningful difference. He looked at Garrett with something that was almost professional appreciation. She planned for multiple contingencies. If the engagement dinner failed, if you survived, and the situation became what it has become, she moves to the next stage. The documents are distributed to 5 separate destination points. Once the distribution is complete, the leverage doesn't reside with one person anymore. It resides with 5, significantly harder to contain. Conrad spoke from beside Garrett. How much time does she have before the transfer completes? Keene glanced at his watch with an expression of mild regret. Less than would be comfortable for you. They left 2 of the security team with Keene and moved. The upper district of Hartford presented itself in glass and concrete and the muted efficiency of a city that conducted serious business without feeling the need to announce it. The building was 12 stories leased under a corporate name that traced back to one of Keene's intermediate entities through 4 steps of corporate structure designed specifically to make tracing it tedious. They took the elevator. The 9th floor corridor was empty and lit with the flat, even light of a building that has no interest in atmosphere. One door at the far end, light visible beneath it. Garrett pushed it open. Celeste Harmon stood at a terminal near the window. She was dressed as though she had a subsequent appointment that mattered. Dark coat hair arranged with its usual precision, the diamond still on her left hand catching the flat Hartford daylight. She had her back to the door. She did not turn when it opened. She finished what she was typing. Then she turned. I was wondering when you'd get here, she said. The voice was identical to the voice that had said good morning to him across the breakfast table for 4 months. It was the same voice that had expressed fear when he mentioned camera footage, the same voice that had cried in the hospital corridor asking why no one was helping him. The voice had not changed. That was the most revealing thing about it. It had not needed to change for any of those situations because it had always been performing, and performance does not require adjustment the way genuine emotion does. You poisoned me, he said, in my own house, at my own table. She did not look away. I made you manageable, she said. That's a more accurate description. You stole from a foundation that serves children. Something moved through her expression at that, not guilt in the way guilt usually appears, but something more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. Not the look of someone who knows they have done wrong, the look of someone who has a different accounting system entirely. I redirected funds from a structure that was operating at a fraction of its potential, she said. Under proper management with the right access and the right relationships, that money becomes leverage for policy changes that would affect healthcare infrastructure across multiple states. You've been sitting on a platform for 15 years without understanding what it could accomplish in different hands. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. So you decided your hands were the right ones. She did not answer. She looked at him with an expression that was for the first time in 11 months entirely without calculation. Not because the calculation had stopped, but because she had decided it was no longer necessary. He looked past her at the terminal. The screen showed a transfer in progress. Document files fragmented, moving toward 5 distribution addresses. The federal contract frameworks, the foundation records, the infrastructure agreements. 40 years of relationships rendered into data and sent out across 5 separate channels. Conrad spoke. "Can we stop it?" His forensics contact at the door said, "We can interrupt part of it, not all. What's already moved has moved." Garrett looked at Celeste. "Stop it." She looked back at him. "It's already done," she said, "or near enough." She pressed a key. The progress indicator completed. The screen updated with 5 confirmation lines, one after another. The room was quiet except for the servers. Then Garrett's phone rang. It was Conrad's forensics contact relayed through Edna Pruitt at the estate, who had found something in the kitchen 90 minutes earlier that she had not immediately understood and had been waiting to report until she was certain she understood it correctly. In Lily's colored pencil box, between the yellow pencil and the orange one wrapped carefully in a paper napkin, was a small folded packet. White. Empty but not entirely, there was residue in the creases, the kind of residue that a laboratory could identify and match and present as evidence in a federal proceeding without ambiguity. Garrett lowered his phone and looked at Conrad. Conrad was already on the second call. When he finished, he turned. "She kept it," he said. "She didn't understand what it was, she just kept it." The room was quiet for a moment. Garrett understood immediately and completely what this meant. Camera footage was footage. It could be disputed, subjected to alternative interpretations by skilled attorneys in well-lit courtrooms, argued into ambiguity. Financial records were records. They could be complicated by layers of corporate structure and the testimony of people who had been paid to complicate them. But a physical packet recovered from the possession of a child who had no motive to fabricate evidence and every reason to have kept it exactly as she described, containing residue that matched the compound identified in Garrett Winslow's blood, that was not arguable. That was the one piece Celeste had not planned for. She had planned for the cameras. She had planned for the financial forensics. She had planned for Keene being located and for Garrett recovering quickly and for the Hartford contingency. She had planned for the envelope at the gate and for the distribution of the documents and for the possibility that her presence in the study would eventually be discovered. She had not planned for an 8-year-old girl who had not been believed and who had therefore decided in the simple, certain logic of a child who has learned that the world does not always honor its obligations to keep the evidence herself. Not because she understood it was evidence, because she understood that if no one believed her, at least she would have something. Garrett looked at Celeste. Something had changed in her face. It was the first time in 11 months that he had seen her face do something it had not chosen to do. The calculation was still present. It would probably always be present, but beneath it for just a moment was the expression of a person who has encountered the one variable they did not include. An 8-year-old with a pencil box. The federal agents arrived 23 minutes later. Celeste did not resist. She stood at the window and looked at the Hartford skyline and did not speak further. The diamond caught the gray December light one last time as they walked her to the elevator, and then the elevator doors closed and she was gone from the room. At the door, she had turned and looked at Garrett one final time. "You weren't supposed to survive that dinner," she said. Garrett looked back at her. "I know. A little girl made sure I did." Celeste was quiet. She looked past him for a moment, as though something in the space behind his shoulder still required calculating. Then the calculation resolved itself into nothing, into the first genuine blankness he had ever seen on her face, and they took her out. The door closed. The drive back to Newport took longer than it should have. Traffic on 95 South had thickened into the slow, compressed crawl of a late Friday afternoon, the kind of traffic that moves in long, patient intervals and stops for reasons that are never visible from where you are sitting. Garrett sat in the back of the lead vehicle and watched the Connecticut sky shift from the flat gray of midday to the deeper, colder blue that comes in December when the light decides it has done enough for the day and begins its early retreat. He thought about 40 years. Not the achievements, not the contracts, or the expansions, or the moments that had ended with handshakes and photographs. He thought about the specific texture of 40 years of work, the mornings that started before anyone else arrived, The decisions made in rooms with no witnesses that turned out to matter more than the decisions made publicly, the slow and unglamorous accumulation of trust that is the actual substance of a reputation. He had thought somewhere in the middle of all of it that the thing he was most vulnerable to was a competitor who understood the business better than he did, or a legal challenge or a market that shifted without warning. He had not thought it would arrive in an ivory dress at his own engagement dinner. He had not thought the person who would be the difference between one outcome and another would be sitting on a step stool in the corner of his kitchen, coloring a horse with a white star on its forehead, quiet enough that no one considered looking. He turned this over in his mind for the length of the drive home and found no angle from which it became simpler or more comfortable. Conrad called from the second vehicle while they were still on the highway. The federal contacts are moving on the distribution endpoints, he said. 3 of the 5 are already frozen. The other 2, the offshore addresses, are being handled through the emergency provisions of the federal healthcare infrastructure contracts. Your prior agreement with the FBI regarding data security is going to do some useful work tonight. Garrett said, good. The forensics on the packet will be expedited given the medical emergency. We should have confirmation within 48 hours. That plus the camera footage, plus the financial trail, plus Keene's cooperation. He's already indicated he's willing to discuss terms, gives us more than enough for federal charges. How many counts? Conrad paused doing the accounting. 14 minimum. Attempted poisoning, financial fraud, theft from a nonprofit conspiracy, unauthorized access to federal contract materials. The specific charges will take shape over the next several weeks, but the foundation is solid. Garrett looked at the brake lights of the car in front of him. Solid, he said. Good. When he came back to the estate, he did not go to the study. He went to the sitting room off the main hallway. He had not planned to go there. His feet simply took him there, the way feet sometimes know where a person needs to be before the person does. Lily was in the large armchair by the window. She had her legs folded beneath her doll in her lap, the colored pencil box open on the cushion beside her. The horse from 2 nights ago had been finished at some point. It was complete, the white star on the forehead, carefully filled in and sitting at the bottom of the box. The drawing on her knee now was a bird. Dark wings, white chest, the precise posture of something built for height. Ruth sat near the door with a book she had not been reading. She looked up when Garrett came in, and the look on her face had something new in it. Not quite ease, not quite familiarity, but the beginning of something that might become one or the other given enough time. Garrett pulled a chair close to the armchair and sat down in it. Not across the room, not standing in the doorway. He pulled the chair until he was at the same level as a child sitting in a large armchair, with her feet folded under her, which required him to sit lower than was comfortable, and he did it anyway. Lily looked up from the drawing. We found her, he said. Lily nodded once with the gravity of someone filing a confirmed report. And the other one, the man who was working with her. He was found in Hartford. Another nod. Garrett looked at the colored pencil box for a moment, then the packet, the one from the kitchen. You kept it in your pencil box. Lily looked at the box, then at him. I didn't know it was important, she said. Not exactly. I just thought. She stopped. Then I saw her throw it toward the waste bin when she came back through after everything started. She missed. It landed on the floor. I picked it up because I thought if nobody believed me, at least I'd still have that. I didn't know what else to do with it. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, it was the most important piece of evidence we had. Without it, everything else could have been argued. With it, nothing can. Lily considered this information with the careful attention she brought to most things. She did not look pleased to have been important. She looked relieved to have been useful, which was a different thing and a better one. He reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the cushion beside her colored pencil box. It sat there white and plain, next to the bow with its faded artwork on the lid. This is for your education, he said. College, if that's what you want. Something else if you find something you want more. It's yours regardless of what you decide. Lily looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up immediately. I didn't do it for a reward, she said. I know, Garrett said. That's exactly why. She looked at him with the same assessing look she had given him across the dining room table, across the hospital bed, at every point where she had needed to determine whether what an adult was saying was true or was simply the kind of thing adults say to make a moment easier to be in. She was 8 years old and she had learned this distinction faster than anyone should have to. Then she picked up the envelope and placed it in the colored pencil box between the blue pencil and the green one and closed the lid. Ruth pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked out the window at the winter garden. From the doorway, Eleanor Winslow watched her son and the child in the armchair and said nothing. Edna Pruitt stood behind her. Neither of them came into the room. The room did not need them. It was full enough already with the weight of what had happened over the past 3 days and the specific, quiet significance of what was happening right now. After a while, Garrett asked, "What is it?" Lily looked at the drawing on her knee. "A hawk," she said. "They can see things from very far away." She said it as a fact the way she said most things, not to impress, not to demonstrate, just to report accurately what she knew. Garrett looked at the drawing. The dark wings, the white chest, the particular stillness of a bird that doesn't need to move to be watching. Then he looked at the child who had made it. "Yes," he said quietly, "they do." He sat in the chair for a while longer. Outside the sitting room window, the December light was going off the harbor in long silver lines across the water, thin and cold and completely honest in the way that late afternoon winter light is always honest. It illuminates what's there and makes no promises about warmth. Inside the estate, the security team completed its final sweep. Conrad made calls from the study. Dr. Tate confirmed by phone that Garrett's blood work from the follow-up draw that morning showed the compound clearing at the expected rate and that the long-term prognosis was straightforwardly good. Eleanor made tea in the kitchen and did not ask anyone if they wanted any. She simply made it and left it where people could find it, which was her way. Ruth helped Edna with the kitchen, moving around each other in the comfortable choreography of two women who had worked in the same space for years. At one point, Ruth stopped and stood at the prep station and looked at the folded linen towel that had been replaced. The original was in an evidence bag in Conrad's briefcase, and she stood there for a moment without moving. Then she smoothed the new towel flat with both hands and went back to work. Lily fell asleep in the armchair at some point after dark, drawing still on her knee pencil, still loosely in one hand. Garrett had left the room by then. Ruth covered her daughter with the blanket from the arm of the sofa and took the pencil carefully from her fingers and set it in the box. She stood and looked at Lily for a long time. Then she turned off the lamp nearest the armchair, leaving the room in the softer light from the hallway, and went to find Eleanor. They sat in the kitchen, Ruth and Eleanor, and drank the tea that had been left out and did not say very much. They did not need to say very much. Some evenings arrive at a place where the important things have already been said, and what remains is simply the quiet act of being present in the same room with another person while the night does what nights do. What happened next happened over the following days and weeks and months, and most of it happened in rooms that were not this one, in language that was legal and procedural, and nothing like the language of a dining room in December. The federal proceedings against Celeste Harmon were formally opened within 72 hours. The charges, when they were filed, numbered 16, two more than Conrad had initially estimated, because the investigation into Keene's records produced evidence of a prior attempt on a different target that had been attributed at the time to natural causes and would now be re-examined. Celeste's attorneys entered a not guilty plea, and then 4 weeks later entered a different plea when the physical evidence, the camera footage, the financial records, and Keene's full cooperation made the original position untenable. Stafford Keene was arrested at a hotel in Atlanta 19 days after the Hartford operation. He had not gone far. Conrad later said that was characteristic of men like Keene. They believed right up until the moment they were wrong that they were smarter than the people looking for them. Marcus Brierly cooperated from the beginning, which his attorney described as a demonstration of good faith, and federal prosecutors described as what happens when a person realizes very quickly that they are the least important person in a conspiracy and should act accordingly. The $1.85 million was recovered in full through the asset freeze executed in the first 48 hours. It was returned to the Winslow Children's Foundation with $4 million additional dollars that Garrett contributed, directly designated specifically for educational programs and youth development initiatives across Rhode Island and in Connecticut. The foundation's new charter, the one Celeste had photographed in the study, was finalized and signed 6 weeks after the engagement dinner that had almost been Garrett's last. The estate returned to itself slowly, the way places return to themselves after something significant has happened in them, not by forgetting but by continuing. The dining room was used again by March. Garrett had the chandelier replaced not because it was damaged, but because he found he preferred the light from a different fixture. The study's security was upgraded to a standard that Conrad called excessive, and Garrett called a reasonable response to demonstrated circumstances. On a morning in early April, when the Winter Garden was beginning to show the first signs of deciding to come back, Edna Pruitt moved a small chair from the storage room off the hallway and placed it beside the kitchen window, the window that looked out over the garden, the one with the view of the harbor past the hedge line and the fountain that was running again quietly in the mild spring air. She did not explain the chair. She did not announce it. She simply placed it there and went back to what she was doing. Ruth understood. Lily understood. Some afternoons, when Ruth's work kept her in the main rooms and the kitchen settled into its midday quiet, Lily sat in the chair by the window with her pencil boss and drew. Hawks mostly lately, though, sometimes horses and sometimes birds she invented from the parts of other birds that she liked best. The harbor was visible past the garden, gray-blue and steady, the same harbor that had been there through all of it and would be there long after. She was 9 now. She would be 10 in the summer. Her feet almost reached the floor. She was still working on a drawing one Thursday afternoon when Garrett came through the kitchen on his way to the garden. He stopped when he saw her. He often stopped when he saw her for a moment, in the way of a person who has not yet fully made peace with what they almost lost. She looked up. He nodded at the drawing. Another hawk. She considered the page. "I think this one's an osprey," she said. "They hunt over water." She looked out the window at the harbor. "They can see fish from 100 feet up." Garrett looked at the drawing, then at the harbor, then at the child who had seen clearly what no one else in a room full of adults had been willing to see. He had thought in the weeks since December about what it meant that an 8-year-old girl had been the one. He had thought about all the reasons he had dismissed her, her age, her position in the household, the social pressure of a room full of people who had already decided. He had thought about the particular well-worn arrogance of a man who has been right about enough things to start assuming he will be right about the next one. He had thought about what it cost to carry something true through a room that didn't want it, and to keep carrying it when it was taken from your hands, and to stay standing when every adult in the room told you to sit down. He had been wrong about the shape of courage. He had thought he knew what it looked like. It had turned out to look like an 8-year-old girl in a borrowed kitchen corner, holding on to the edge of a plate. He pulled a chair from the kitchen table and sat down beside the window. Lily moved the pencil box slightly to give him room, not looking up from the drawing. They sat for a while, the 68-year-old man and the 9-year-old girl in the kitchen of the house where she had grown up, in the corners, and he had built a life around the center, watching the harbor do what harbors do, accept the light and the weather and the passage of time, with the same even unhurried attention, not making anything of it, not needing to. Outside, spring was moving across Newport the way it always moved, without asking permission, without announcing itself, simply arriving and getting on with the work of making things new again. The osprey in Lily's drawing had its wings fully open. She was working on the eye now, small and precise, and set at exactly the angle that would make it look like the bird was watching something very far below, something it had already decided it was going to catch. Garrett watched her work. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "You're going to be remarkable." Lily did not look up. She was adding a detail to the wing, a row of small feathers along the leading edge that she had been working out in her mind for the past 10 minutes and was only now ready to put on the page. "I already am," she said. She said it the way she said most things, not to argue, not to impress, simply to report accurately what she understood to be true. Garrett looked at the drawing. "Yes," he said, "you are." The harbor moved in the middle distance. The fountain ran in the garden. The kitchen was warm and quiet and smelled of the coffee Edna had made an hour ago and left on the counter, because that was what Edna did. And somewhere in the house, Ruth was working and Eleanor was reading, and the estate was doing what it had always done, sitting above the harbor quietly without apology, as though it had always been there and always would be. And in the kitchen by the window, a 9-year-old girl drew an osprey with its eye set on something far below, and the drawing was very good and her feet almost reached the floor.